I think this particular section has some relevant words for us today, and we'll try to, as we dig in and unpack this section, bring out the relevancy to us today. So here's the situation in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Last week we talked about the birth of Samuel. Remember, he had a mother named Hannah who had trouble getting pregnant, didn't think she'd ever be able to have children. She prays to the Lord, asks the Lord to bless her with a son, and she makes a deal with God and says, if you give me a son, then I will dedicate him all his life to your service. And she keeps her word. And so Samuel is raised to be a priest in the Lord's service, to be a judge for God's people, to be a prophet, to be a leader. And Samuel is very effective at doing this. In fact, the time of Samuel's leadership is a very good time for the people, because he's drawing them back to following the teachings of God. He's helping them work through situations. He's helping them deal with their enemies. You know, before Samuel came along, when you go back to the book of Judges and Ruth were written during the same time that precede 1 Samuel. One of the last verses in the book of Judges says that people during that time did whatever they thought was right. Does that sound a little familiar today? There was no ruler. People just did what they thought was right. And you know what happens, what history teaches us happens in a society where what we feel is right governs everything, because everyone has different views of that. And then Samuel comes along, and in essence, God uses him to restore a sense of order and calm among the people. But that doesn't last forever either. And in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, here's the situation that Samuel's dealing with, beginning in verse 1. The text says, as Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel, Joel and Abijah. His oldest sons held court in a town in a city called Beersheba. But they were not like their father. They were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. So here you have this great leader in Samuel who the people respect and admire and listen to. But he's got two sons who he has put in positions of authority that are not following their father's footsteps, that are not walking according to the ways of the Lord. We read that they are greedy, that they accept bribes. I'm going to tell you something, church. That still happens today. That still happens today. Where people will accept bribes and people's greed will drive them instead of doing what is good. Samuel's dealing with this, but he's dealing with it in his own family. And the people have had enough. And so they come to their respected leader. And they express their displeasure over what is happening. Well, that's a tough one for Samuel. These are his sons. He doesn't want to hear that his sons are doing the things that they're doing. That's a tough pill to swallow as a parent. But Samuel has to deal with this. And notice that his response to what they say in verse 6. Samuel was displeased with their request, and he went to the Lord for guidance. Now don't read that too quickly and think, well, Samuel was a little upset by that. No, read where it says displeased, read angry. Read those emotions that you would have if you were in Samuel's position and someone came to you with such disturbing news. How would you respond to that? Would you question your effectiveness as a parent? Would you think that you failed your children? Would you be upset that your children were doing these things, that they weren't following the Lord, that they hadn't listened and obeyed what you had taught them to? Displeased represents an incredible amount of emotion here that Samuel is dealing with at the moment. But I want you to notice what Samuel does. Where does he go with this negative emotion? He goes to God. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. The people's answer to the problem of Samuel's sons and the injustice that's going on is they want a king. Now, the Israelites had never had a king before. But they're looking around at other nations and seeing other nations have kings. And so they believe that this is a solution. Not only are they rejecting the injustice of Samuel's sons, which they should, because you had unjust people taking bribes and operating out of greed. They should be rejected. But they're also rejecting Samuel. It's almost like they're telling Samuel, thanks, you're a little too old now, we need someone new. You ever heard that phrase, what have you done for me lately? We tend to be a forgetful people, and we dwell in the moment. Sports fans do this all the time. Your team could win a major championship, but the next year you have a losing record, you want the coach to be fired. It's tough, isn't it? That's where Samuel is right now. Everything good that's happened during his leadership, they're saying, well, that was nice, thank you, Samuel. You're a little too old, we want a king. Because the other nations have a king, and it seems to be working really well for them. So Samuel goes to the Lord with this. And here's what God tells him in verse 7. Do everything they say. Do it. For they are rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods. And now they are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. And so Samuel does this. He begins to warn them. And here's what he tells them. Here's what this king will do. He will draft your sons, and he will assign them to his chariots and his charioteers. He will make them run before his chariots. He will make some generals and some captains. Some will be forced to work in the fields, harvest his crops. Some will make his weapons and equipment. The king will take your daughters from you and will force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. He will take away the best of your fields and distribute it among his officers and attendants. He will take your male and female slaves. He will demand the finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. He will demand a tenth of your flocks, and he will make you his slaves. When that day comes, you will beg for relief from this king you are demanding, but then the Lord will not help you. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you were talking to a brick wall? You can't even finish the sentence because the brick wall gets in the way. Where you're telling someone, I know this is what you think you want right now, but please listen. This is not going to be a good thing in the end. This is not going to lead you where you want to go. My father always has had an uncanny ability when I was growing up. He let me make my own decisions, but he'd sit down with me and he'd say, I'm going to tell you something. You're free to make that decision, but let me tell you where that decision will lead you. Sometimes we reach out to people and we see the train wreck before it happens. And we try to pull them back. And it's like talking to a brick wall. And Samuel here is in this kind of position. These people he has ministered to, he has led, he has given his life to. They're just not listening. And so he spells it out for them as clear as he can. Here is what will happen if you get this king that you want. And he makes a compelling case. You ever done that? You felt like you were ministering to someone and you made an ironclad, compelling case, and you thought for sure you had them persuaded, and they looked at you and said, nah, I still think I want that. Yeah. Notice what the people do. They refuse to listen to Samuel's warning. They basically tuned him out. Doesn't that frustrate you when someone does that to you? When you're talking to them and you can tell they are not listening to a word that you're saying. Even so, we still want a king, they said. We want to be like the nations around us. Our king will judge us. Our king will lead us into battle. Don't miss how personal this is. Our king will judge us. That's what Samuel's been doing. Our king will lead us into battle. Samuel did that when it was warranted. This is a rejection. This is a rejection. No, we want somebody else. We don't want you any longer, Samuel. Now, the behavior of his sons, the evil behavior of his sons, opened the door here for the people to do this. They didn't recognize what they already had. Back in Genesis chapter 17, the first book of the Bible, tells us that God enters into a covenant with a man named Abram. You know him as Abraham. And it's an everlasting covenant, and all these people that will come, the descendants of Abraham, will be blessed by this everlasting covenant with God. The people choose not covenant in this case, but they choose a different form of government. You see, they already had a ruler. His name was Yahweh. His name is Yahweh. Jehovah. God. The Lord of hosts. See, the people were part of a government known as a theocracy. A theocracy has one ruler, God. And people would serve under God in ministering to the people like Samuel did. So Samuel was not the ruler of the people. God was the ultimate ruler of the people. They don't want a theocracy any longer because other nations don't have a theocracy. Instead, they want a monarchy. We want a king to rule over us. We want something different. Because when you look around, look at what everyone else is doing. And here we find the danger of getting what you want when you want it. Has there ever been a time in your life where you prayed to God for something? You were absolutely convinced in your mind that this is what I need right now at this moment. Maybe you were praying for a job, and you're like, oh, this would be perfect for my career. It would help advance me. It would do all these wonderful things. It's going to look really good on my resume one day. I've got to have this job. Please, God, please, God, please, God, give me this job. And the job went to somebody else. Yeah. And you thought, I prayed to God. I asked him to give me this job. I go to church every Sunday. I give money when the collection plates pass. I even go to Sunday school. And God, how could you do that to me? And we forget that God sees more to the story than we are capable of seeing. That when God says no, it's because there's a bigger yes. There's a bigger opportunity. There's something better that he has planned for you. And you may think this is the absolute best thing. And God's saying, no, I'm not going to let you settle. I've got bigger plans for you. I love the testimony. One of my favorite baseball players of all time. A player named Dave Dravecky. Anybody remember Dave Dravecky when he played? You remember Dave Dravecky got cancer in his arm, shoulder area, upper arm. And you may remember the day he was pitching when he threw a pitch and his arm just snapped. Ended his career. Dave Dravecky has written a couple books since then. He ended up losing his arm to cancer. And he goes around talking, and one of the things that he says that is so important for all of us to hear is he said, you know what? God has something bigger in store for me than baseball. Now, how many of us could say that? You're making millions of dollars playing a game. You're in front of thousands of people every week cheering. That's the life, man. Man, what could be better than being a professional athlete or a famous actor or actress or a musician? That would be the life. But Dave Dravecky reminds us that there are bigger things than baseball. And you may be at a time in your life and you're wondering, what is God doing with my life right now? And it may not make any sense until you look through the eyes of faith. And then it hits you. God has something bigger in store for me. Have you ever looked back and told God, thank you for saying no to that request? When we insist on something despite wise counsel from others, godly people whom we look up to, when we become overly emotional, the heart can be deceptive. We lose sight and we fail to see what are called red flags. Now, when you see a red flag at the beach, what does that mean? Don't go in the water, right? It's not advised. When you see 2 flags, it's like, don't go in the water, seriously. It's bad. There are red flags sometimes in relationships. And when we don't listen to wise counsel, when we don't cover that relationship in prayer to God, we sometimes fail to see many red flags. When I have a couple come in for premarital counseling, and we start talking about stressful areas of marriage, and I say, what do you guys argue about? And they say, we never argue. I thought, uh-oh, red flag. Because now my mission is I've got to get them into an argument. So they can learn how to argue without tearing each other apart. Because we don't do that very well, do we? Sometimes our emotions can cloud our judgment. And we fail to see the red flags. This happens a lot in our relationships. Before I went into full-time ministry, I was a sports editor for a newspaper. And one of the things when you write an article and you think this is an incredible article, I mean, this is a piece of work that will be hailed as one of the best pieces ever in the history of journalism. When you start feeling that way, you read your article and you miss the mistakes that are in your article. So what we would do as a staff is we all had our red pens and we would read each other's articles. And by the time the articles got back to the original author, they were draped in red ink. And all of a sudden you realize, wow, I got so caught up in thinking how great my article was, I missed a lot of things in there. And that's why we listen to wise counsel from others. Unfortunately, the Israelites here don't listen to Samuel, the word that God has given him. They fail to see the red flags. And it costs them. Can you think of a time in your life when you have ever felt the pain of rejection? That's what happens to Samuel here. I want you to remember that Samuel has poured his heart into serving these people. Ever since he was a child, he's been raised to minister to people. And now they flat out reject him. Have you ever felt that kind of rejection in your life? Have you ever felt that sting, that pain that comes with such rejection? I want you to pay attention to what God tells Samuel in light of that rejection. God says this, do everything they say to you, and here's the part I want you to see. It's circled on the next slide. For they are rejecting me, not you. You see, God can tell Samuel that because Samuel is doing what God has asked him to do. He's not gone off on his own. He's not ignoring what God wants him to do. He is doing what God has asked him to do. When you in your life are doing what God has called you to do, and you are practicing the teachings of Christ in your daily life, and you're doing that with a Christ-like attitude, that's important because you can try to do everything right and still be a jerk about it. You're doing it with a Christ-like attitude, and you're rejected. That rejection is ultimately not geared toward you. It's geared toward God.
Yeah.
And that's painful. It's still painful, isn't it? When you're working with people and you're saying, here's what needs to happen. Let's reconcile here. Let's practice principles that will lead to restoration as outlined in the Bible. Let's forgive. And people choose to hang on to anger and bitterness. That's a rejection of God, ultimately. That's saying, God, we don't really trust you. We don't trust that forgiveness is the best path. We don't trust that we should let go of our anger. We don't trust that we should not entertain bitterness. We don't trust that your love and your mercy and your grace and your peace is sufficient enough. And that's a dangerous place to be. So how do we deal with rejection? God has some good words for Samuel. They're rejecting me, not you. Jesus said something in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember that? When people persecute you and falsely say all kinds of things against you on behalf of me, rejoice, for great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they treated the prophets who were before you. Dealing with rejection. First, avoid the hall of bitterness. That's not a place you want to be. The Bible says in Hebrews chapter 12 that we should make sure that none of us fall short of the grace of God. And we should make sure that among God's people, no bitter root grow up. Because what that bitter root will do is defile the entire group. Yeah. Bitterness is simply unacceptable in the body of Christ. It's a testament that we don't trust in God's healing power, and we're not willing to walk by faith in what God calls us to do. Don't let bitterness creep up. Avoid the closet of anger. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 5, 21 and 22, that we will be judged based on our anger. Being angry subjects us to judgment. He reminds us of God's standard in Matthew 7 and over in Luke as well, where he tells us, you need to be careful here. The standard you use is the standard that God will use for you. So if you can't let something go that someone has done or said, and you're continually stewing over that, and you're beating them over the head with, well, you did this, and you said this, and you're going on, then that is exactly what God will do to you. The standard you use to others is the standard that God will use for you. Now, avoid the allure of gossip. It's one of the unspoken sins in churches, right? Because we give it different definitions. Well, that's not really gossip. But when we sit around and we talk about people, and we're not talking to those people, it does a lot of damage. When we refuse to gossip, a quarrel dies down. Gossip is like squirting lighter fluid on a flickering flame. Makes it worse. And everybody gets burned. And avoid the road of revenge. When I talk about anger and revenge here, we're seeing a world that is capitulating to anger and to revenge. Where does it end? Where does it end? How many people have to die? How many people have to be killed before someone stands up and says, you know what? This is not the way of God. This is not how we work through difficult situations. This is not the example that we have in Jesus Christ. You know what God did to save the world? He sent His Son not to take power, not to ride in and conquer the authorities with a sword, but to lay down His life and be crucified. That's how God saves the world. Yeah. Because that self-sacrifice, that willing sacrifice that Jesus gave for us, it wasn't about asserting His authority. It wasn't about crushing us because we've been disobedient, we've broken God's law. It was about laying down His life. Yeah. Isn't that what we read about also in Romans? But God demonstrates His own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I want you to repeat after me. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now I want you to change the second part and take out us and put the word me in there. In the first part, put the word I. while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. While I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. These situations that are happening in our communities, God has shown us how to deal with this. He has shown us what true love looks like, and He's shown us how to change the world. Christ died more than 2,000 years ago on a cross outside of Jerusalem. And there are still millions of people throughout the world that follow His teachings. Why is that? And how can we implement that? One way is by not taking the road of revenge. Do you realize as Christians, we are not afforded the right to take revenge? The Bible is very clear about this. That we must leave room for God's wrath. God says, I will repay. Vengeance is mine. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. And more killing will beget more killing. And more wars will beget more wars. And more violence will beget more violence. That is not the way to save the world. That's not the way to deal with the problems in our world. The way is to follow in the steps of Jesus. Jesus said, you've heard, the law says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Matthew chapter 5, 38 and 39. So, as we're trying to work through and not take a negative path when we encounter situations like Samuel has, what will God do for us? First thing God will do is God will reassure you of who you are. In the book of Isaiah chapter 43, verse 1, God says to a beaten down, oppressed people, He says, you are mine. I have called you by name. You are mine. God reassures you of who you are. Secondly, God will restore the joy of your salvation. You may not feel like there's much joy in your salvation. You may feel like your faith is pretty, God will lift you up and restore the joy that's connected with walking in His paths and the salvation He offers. And one of my wife's favorite ones, God will collect all your tears in a bottle. You know what that says? God doesn't miss a single tear you cry. Not a single one. He knows every single one. All your sorrows He has written in a book. He's recorded each one. There are a lot of ways you can show someone how you care. But that's powerful imagery. God knows every tear you have ever cried. And God will draw near to you. And He will rescue you when you feel completely crushed. When your spirit has been beaten down and you can't go on anymore, Psalm 34 verse 18 reminds us that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. So this morning, you've got a couple of options. You could do what Samuel did. And when these bad things happen in your life, you can go to the Lord for guidance. Or you can take the path of the people who Samuel pleads with. And they ignore what he has to say, and they will not listen. So will you trust God enough this morning to put His teachings into practice, to walk in the steps of Christ in your daily life, to not take matters into your own hands, but to do what Jesus would do in every single situation? Will you trust enough this morning to do that? Or will you leave here like the people Samuel talked to, not having a word that's been spoken? I'm asking you this morning to decide. I'm asking you to make that decision this morning. To give your life to Christ in baptism, to repent of the sin in your life, to turn to Him this morning. Will you do that right now as we stand and sing?